In the summer of 1943, deep in the mountains of occupied Yugoslavia, a group of resistance fighters found themselves trapped in a narrow valley with German forces closing in from three sides. The fourth side offered only a sheer cliff face that seemed impossible to climb. As machine gun fire echoed through the rocks and the enemy tightened their grip, hope faded with each passing minute. But sometimes, when all seems lost, courage appears in the most unexpected form. Sometimes it takes just one person, one moment of pure determination to turn the tide of fate. What happened next on that forsaken ridge would become legend among the resistance fighters. A single gunshot that would echo through history and prove that even in the darkest hour, freedom fighters never truly stand alone. This is the true story of Maria Kovac, a woman whose name was whispered with reverence in the villages of Yugoslavia, and the day her rifle spoke louder than any army. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like a ghostly shroud as Captain Nikola Petrovich led his band of 17 resistance fighters through the treacherous paths of the Dinaric Alps. The year was 1943, and Yugoslavia had been under Nazi occupation for 2 brutal years. Every step they took was a gamble with death. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier, and every sound could signal their doom. Petrovich was a man carved from the very mountains he defended. His weathered face told stories of countless battles, and his steel-gray eyes had seen too much death for someone barely 30 years old. Before the war, he had been a simple schoolteacher in the village of Drvar, teaching children about their proud history and ancient traditions. Now he taught lessons in survival and resistance, where failure meant not just a failing grade, but a bullet to the head. The group moved in single file along the narrow mountain path, their worn boots silent against the rocky ground. Each fighter carried what little they could: an old rifle, a handful of ammunition, some bread and cheese wrapped in cloth, and an unbreakable determination to free their homeland from the iron grip of fascism. They were part of the Yugoslav partisans, irregular forces that had been fighting a guerrilla war against the occupying Axis powers since the invasion began. Among the fighters was young Stefan Markovic, barely 18 years old, whose father had been executed by German forces for harboring resistance sympathizers. The boy's hands shook slightly as he gripped his rifle, not from fear, but from barely controlled rage. Beside him walked Anna Davidovic, a nurse who had fled her hospital when the Nazis began using it as a torture center. She carried medical supplies instead of extra ammunition, knowing that in this war, saving lives was as important as taking them. There was also Milos Stankovic, a former police officer whose intimate knowledge of the local terrain had saved the group countless times. His mustache was now gray where it had once been black, aged not by years, but by the weight of watching his country burn. Behind him limped Jovan Nikolek, a veteran of the Great War who insisted on fighting despite his wounded leg. He claimed the mountains gave him strength, and his fellow fighters had learned not to question the old warrior's wisdom. The resistance cell had been operating in this region for 8 months, conducting hidden, run attacks on German supply convoys, sabotaging railway lines, and providing intelligence to the main partisan forces. They had become ghosts of the mountains, striking without warning and disappearing into the maze of caves and hidden paths that only locals knew. The German command had grown increasingly frustrated with these mountain phantoms and had dedicated significant resources to hunting them down. As they crested a small ridge, Petrovich raised his hand, signaling the group to halt. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from the village of Glamic. It was too much smoke for cooking fires or even a celebration. The fighters exchanged grim looks, understanding immediately what the smoke meant. Another village had felt the Nazi boot. Another community had paid the price for the resistance's activities. They had been heading toward Glamic to meet with another resistance cell and coordinate a major operation against a German ammunition depot. The plan had been months in the making, involving fighters from 3 different groups and precise timing that would allow them to strike hard and fast before disappearing back into the mountains. Now, seeing the smoke, they knew that plan was finished before it began. Petrovich studied the terrain ahead through a pair of cracked binoculars he had taken from a dead German officer. The path down to the valley floor was exposed, offering little cover except for scattered boulders and stunted pine trees. Beyond the valley, the mountains rose again, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the warm summer weather. It was beautiful country, the kind that poets wrote about and artists tried to capture. Now it had become a battlefield where beauty and brutality existed side by side. The captain made his decision quickly. They would circle around the valley, staying high on the mountain slopes where the terrain favored them. It would take longer, but it was safer than trying to cross the open ground below. He turned to signal the change in direction when young Stefan suddenly grabbed his arm. The boy was pointing toward the opposite ridge, his face pale with alarm. Through the morning haze, they could see movement, the unmistakable silhouettes of soldiers making their way along the mountain path. Even from this distance, the gray-green uniforms were clearly visible, and the disciplined formation told them these were regular German troops, not the local militia units they usually encountered. Petrovich cursed under his breath and immediately began scanning the other approaches to their position. His heart sank as he spotted more troops moving up the valley from the south and still more approaching from the north. It was a coordinated sweep, the kind of operation that required significant planning and resources. Someone had betrayed them, or the Germans had finally learned enough about their movements to predict where they would be. The fighters quickly took defensive positions among the rocks, but their situation was desperate. The mountain path behind them led only to steeper cliffs and dead ends. Ahead lay the valley floor, but it was now crawling with German troops. To their left and right, more enemy soldiers were methodically closing the trap. They were surrounded with no hope of escape, just as the title of their story would later describe. Anna checked her medical supplies, knowing they would likely be needed soon. Stefan tried to calm his shaking hands by focusing on his rifle, checking and rechecking that it was properly loaded. Miloš studied the approaching troops through binoculars, counting their numbers and trying to identify their weapons. The old veteran Jovan simply sat quietly against a boulder, his experienced eyes watching everything and calculating their chances. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the protective mist that had concealed their movements. Now they were exposed on a rocky slope, with nowhere to run and insufficient cover for a prolonged battle. The German troops were taking their time, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They knew the resistance fighters were trapped, and they intended to finish this hunt once and for all. Petrovich gathered his fighters in a small circle, speaking in low tones that wouldn't carry on the mountain wind. Each person understood that this might be their last conversation, their final moments of freedom before death or capture. The captain's voice was steady, showing no trace of the fear that gnawed at his stomach. He told them they would fight to the last bullet, that surrender was not an option. They all knew what happened to captured partisans: torture, execution, and often the massacre of their family members as punishment. Better to die free on their beloved mountains than to give the fascists the satisfaction of breaking their spirits in some dungeon. The fighters spread out among the rocks, each taking the best position they could find. The German troops were now close enough that they could hear the occasional voice, the clink of metal on stone, the sound of boots on the rocky path. The trap was nearly closed, and soon the killing would begin. As they waited for the inevitable assault, none of them could have imagined that salvation would come in the form of a single woman's shot thundering from the forsaken ridge above. None of them knew that Maria Kovac was already moving into position, her keen eyes watching the drama unfold below, her finger caressing the trigger of a rifle that had never missed its mark. The mountains of Yugoslavia had seen many battles throughout their long history, but few would be remembered with the same mixture of terror and wonder as the battle that was about to begin. In the space of a few minutes, despair would turn to hope, defeat would become victory, and a legend would be born that would inspire resistance fighters for generations to come. High above the trapped resistance fighters, Maria Kovac moved through the pine forest with the silence of a hunting wolf. At 28 years old, she had already become a legend among the Yugoslav partisans, though few had actually seen her face. She was known by many names: the Ghost of the Mountains, the Angel of Death, the Silent Thunder. But to those who knew her personally, she was simply Maria, a woman who had lost everything to the war and had chosen to make the mountains themselves her weapon of revenge. Maria had been born in a small village nestled in these very mountains, the daughter of a blacksmith who had taught her to shoot before she could properly write her own name. Her father, Dmitry Kovac, had been a veteran of the Balkan Wars and understood that in this part of the world, knowing how to defend yourself was not just useful, it was essential for survival. He had trained his daughter with the same care and attention he gave to forging a perfect blade, and Maria had proven to be an exceptional student. When the Axis powers invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941, Maria's world had shattered like glass. Her village had been one of the first to resist the occupation, and the Germans had made an example of it that was both swift and terrible. They had gathered all the men in the village square, including her father and her younger brother Alexander, and shot them down like dogs. The women and children were loaded onto trucks and taken to labor camps, but Maria had escaped during the chaos, fleeing into the mountains she knew better than the streets of any city. For 2 years, she had lived like a wild animal, sleeping in caves, drinking from mountain streams, and surviving on whatever she could hunt or forage. But she had not simply hidden away. She had become a one-woman army, striking at German patrols and supply convoys with deadly precision before vanishing back into the wilderness. Her rifle, her father's old hunting weapon that she had grabbed during her escape, had become an instrument of legendary accuracy. German soldiers spoke of her in whispered tones, creating stories that grew more fantastic with each telling. The rifle itself was a thing of beauty and death. It was a Mauser Model 1924, originally made for the Yugoslav Royal Army, with modifications that her father had made to improve its accuracy. The barrel had been carefully rebaired, the trigger mechanism refined, and the wooden stock carved with traditional Serbian designs that seemed to come alive in the mountain light. Maria had added her own modifications over the years, including a crude but effective scope fashioned from binoculars taken from a dead German officer. She had been tracking the Germans' sweep operation for 3 days, moving parallel to their advance like a shadow they could never quite catch. She knew these mountains better than the Germans knew their own hometowns, understanding every game trail, every hidden valley, every cave that could provide shelter or concealment. She had watched them deploy their troops with a methodical precision that made the German army so formidable, but she had also seen their weakness, their reliance on maps and radios instead of the intimate knowledge that came from being born to the mountains. When Maria spotted Petrovic's resistance cell being trapped in the valley, she felt a familiar fire kindle in her chest. She had heard of the schoolteacher-turned-fighter, knew his reputation for protecting civilian villages and conducting operations that minimized harm to innocent people. In a war where brutality was becoming commonplace on all sides, Petrovic represented something pure, a fighter who had not lost his humanity despite everything he had endured. She positioned herself on the forsaken ridge that overlooked the entire valley, a rocky outcropping that the Germans had dismissed as impossible to reach. They had not considered that someone who had spent her entire life in these mountains might see possibilities where they saw only obstacles. The climb to reach the ridge had taken her 3 hours, moving carefully to avoid dislodging stones that might give away her position. From her perch, Maria could see the entire battlefield spread out below her like a deadly chess game. The German forces were moving with textbook precision, closing the net around the trapped partisans with overwhelming firepower and superior numbers. She counted at least 60 soldiers in total, organized into 3 separate groups that were converging on the small band of resistance fighters. It was a perfectly executed operation, the kind that would normally result in the complete destruction of the surrounded force. But the Germans had made one crucial error. They had not considered the possibility of intervention from above. Their attention was focused entirely on the trapped fighters below, and none of them thought to look up at the seemingly inaccessible ridge where Maria now lay prone among the rocks, her rifle trained on the drama unfolding beneath her. She studied the German positions through her improvised scope, identifying officers by their behavior and equipment. The commander of the operation was easy to spot, a tall man with a peaked cap who stood slightly apart from his soldiers, occasionally raising binoculars to study the resistance positions. He was coordinating the attack by radio, speaking into a handset while pointing at various positions on the mountainside. Maria had learned to read the signs of an impending assault. The German troops were checking their weapons one final time, fixing bayonets and preparing grenades. Their officers were making final adjustments to positions, ensuring that every angle was covered and escape routes were blocked. In a few more minutes, they would begin their attack, and the 17 brave fighters below would face impossible odds. She thought of her father as she settled into her shooting position, remembering his voice as he taught her the fundamentals of marksmanship. He had always said that shooting was not just about the mechanics of operating a rifle. It was about patience, breathing, understanding wind and distance, and above all, having the mental clarity to make the shot when it mattered most. He had taught her that a single well-placed bullet could change the course of a battle, that precision was more valuable than volume of fire. Maria's breathing slowed as she entered the almost meditative state that preceded her most important shots. The world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the rifle, the target, and the mathematics of trajectory and wind drift that would determine whether the shot found its mark. She had made shots like this before, but never with so much hanging in the balance. The German commander raised his binoculars again, scanning the resistance positions. In that moment, he represented everything that Maria hated about the occupation. The arrogance of invaders who thought they could crush the spirit of a Yugoslav people, the cold calculation that reduced human lives to tactical problems to be solved. He stood there confident in his superiority, never suspecting that death was watching him through the scope of a rifle held by a woman whose entire family he and his kind had murdered. Maria's finger found the trigger and applied the gentlest pressure, not enough to fire yet, but enough to feel the precise point where the shot would break. She calculated the distance, approximately 400 meters, and adjusted for the mountain wind that would push the bullet slightly to the left. The shot would be challenging, but not impossible, well within the range of what she had accomplished before. Down in the valley, she could see the resistance fighters preparing for their final stand. They moved with the grim determination of people who knew they were about to die, but refused to give up without a fight. She saw young Stefan checking his rifle with shaking hands, saw Anna preparing bandages for wounds that might never have the chance to heal, saw old Jovan sitting calmly against his rock as if he were waiting for a bus rather than a bullet. The German commander lowered his binoculars and reached for his radio, preparing to give the order that would unleash hell on the brave fighters below. It was time for Maria to remind these invaders that in the mountains of Yugoslavia, they were never truly safe, never truly in control. Her father's rifle was about to speak with a voice of thunder that would echo across the valley and into legend. The silence before the storm was broken by a crack of thunder that seemed to split the mountain itself in half. Maria's rifle spoke with a voice that echoed off every cliff face and rocky outcropping, carrying across the valley like the roar of an angry god. The bullet flew true across 400 meters of mountain air, guided by years of practice and fueled by 2 years of burning hatred for the invaders who had destroyed her world. The German commander never knew what hit him. One moment he was reaching for his radio to order the final assault, confident in his tactical superiority and overwhelming numbers. The next moment he was crumpling to the ground, his peaked cap rolling away down the rocky slope as his lifeless body fell among the stones. The single shot had found its mark with surgical precision, entering just below his left ear and ending his war in an instant. For several seconds, the entire battlefield seemed frozen in shocked silence. German soldiers stared at their fallen commander in disbelief, trying to process what had just happened. The shot had come from somewhere above them, but the ridge from which it was fired was supposed to be impossible to reach. Their tactical manuals had not prepared them for an enemy who could materialize from thin air and strike with lethal accuracy from positions they considered secure. Captain Petrovich and his resistance fighters were equally stunned, but their shock quickly transformed into desperate hope. The German attack had been halted in its tracks, thrown into confusion by the death of their leader. Petrovich had fought enough battles to recognize opportunity when he saw it, and he immediately began shouting orders to his scattered fighters. This was their chance, perhaps their only chance, to turn disaster into victory. Maria did not pause to admire her handiwork. Even before the echo of her first shot had faded, she was already working the bolt of her rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. The German troops were beginning to react to their commander's death, some seeking cover while others tried to locate the source of the deadly shot. She had perhaps 10 seconds before they would begin returning fire at her position. Her next target was obvious: the radio operator who was frantically trying to establish contact with other German units. If he succeeded in calling for reinforcements or air support, the momentary advantage gained by killing the commander would be quickly lost. The radio operator was crouched behind a large boulder about 350 meters away, the antenna of his radio set visible above the rock that sheltered him. Maria adjusted her aim slightly, accounting for the different range and the fact that her target was partially concealed. She could see just enough of the radio operator's body to make the shot possible, but it would require perfect placement. There was no room for error. A wounded enemy could still operate a radio, and a miss would give away her exact position to the remaining German forces. She controlled her breathing, letting half a breath out and holding the rest as her father had taught her so many years ago. The crosshairs of her improvised scope settled on the small portion of the radio operator that was visible, and she squeezed the trigger with the same smooth pressure that had served her so well throughout this deadly war. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and another crack of thunder rolled across the valley. The second shot was as perfect as the first. The radio operator pitched forward, his equipment tumbling down the mountainside as his fingers lost their grip on life. The radio itself struck a rock and broke apart in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, ensuring that no call for help would be sent from this particular battlefield. Down in the valley, the German troops were beginning to panic. They had lost their commander, and their communications in the space of 20 seconds, struck by an enemy they could not see from a position they had thought was secure. Some of the more experienced, non-commissioned officers tried to maintain order, shouting commands and attempting to reorganize the scattered soldiers, but fear was spreading through their ranks like wildfire. Maria's third shot took down a sergeant who was trying to rally his men near a cluster of pine trees. Her fourth silenced a machine gunner who was setting up his weapon to spray the ridge with suppressing fire. Each shot was delivered with the same methodical precision, each one carefully chosen to maximize the psychological impact on the surviving German forces while eliminating their most dangerous fighters. The resistance fighters below were quick to capitalize on the chaos that Maria's intervention had created. Petrovich led a charge down the slope, his men firing as they advanced toward the confused and demoralized German positions. Young Stefan moved like a man possessed, his earlier nervousness transformed into deadly focus as he worked his way from rock to rock, picking off targets of opportunity. Anna stayed back to treat the wounded, but even she was firing whenever a clear shot presented itself. Milos used his knowledge of the terrain to outflank a group of German soldiers who had taken cover behind a stone wall. His police training served him well as he approached their position from an unexpected angle, taking them by surprise with a burst of automatic fire that sent the survivors scrambling for better cover. Old Jovan proved that his age had not diminished his fighting ability, moving with surprising speed and accuracy as he engaged targets across the valley floor. The battle had turned into a nightmare for the German forces. They were being attacked from above by an unseen sniper whose shots seemed to find their mark every time, while below they faced determined resistance fighters who fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. The careful tactical plan that had seemed so perfect an hour earlier was now in complete shambles. Maria continued her deadly work from the ridge, methodically eliminating German officers and specialists while staying mobile to avoid the return fire that was now being directed at her position. She had learned the importance of movement during her 2 years as a lone wolf fighter. Staying in one place too long meant death, even if that place seemed secure. She fired from one position, then quickly moved 20 or 30 meters before firing again, making it nearly impossible for the enemy to pin down her exact location. The Germans tried desperately to coordinate a response to the unexpected assault, but without their commander and radio operator, their ability to work as a cohesive unit had been severely compromised. Individual squads were fighting their own separate battles, unable to support each other effectively or execute any kind of unified strategy. Some groups tried to retreat, while others attempted to advance, creating confusion and friendly fire incidents that further degraded their combat effectiveness. As the battle raged on, the legendary status that Maria had earned through 2 years of ghost-like warfare was being enhanced by every shot she fired. The German survivors would later tell stories of a demon sniper who could hit targets at impossible ranges, who appeared and disappeared like a spirit of the mountains themselves. These stories would grow in the telling, becoming part of the folklore that helped sustain the resistance movement during the darkest days of the occupation. But for Maria herself, crouched among the rocks of the forsaken ridge with her father's rifle growing hot in her hands, there was no time for thoughts of legend or folklore. There was only the immediate tactical situation, the next target in her scope, and the mathematical precision required to place each bullet exactly where it would do the most good. The battle was far from over, and the trapped resistance fighters below were depending on her continued accuracy to turn their desperate situation into an unlikely victory. The thunder from the ridge would continue to roll across the valley for many more minutes, each crack announcing another blow struck for the freedom of Yugoslavia and the honor of those who had died fighting for it. The German forces were crumbling under the unexpected assault from above and the renewed vigor of the resistance fighters below. What had begun as a methodical sweep to eliminate a small band of partisans had transformed into a chaotic nightmare where every shadow might hide death and every rock could conceal an enemy rifle. The psychological impact of Maria's invisible presence on the ridge was proving to be as devastating as her actual marksmanship. A young German lieutenant named Klaus Weber tried desperately to salvage the situation. Weber was barely 22 years old, fresh from the military academy at Potsdam, and this was his first real combat command. He had studied tactics and strategy in comfortable classrooms, learning about the superiority of German military doctrine and the inevitable victory of the Reich. Nothing in his training had prepared him for fighting an enemy who seemed to materialize from the mountains themselves. Weber shouted orders to his scattered men, trying to establish some kind of defensive perimeter while under fire from multiple directions. His voice cracked with strain as he called for his soldiers to maintain their positions and return fire, but his words carried little authority when delivered from behind the boulder where he crouched for protection. The confident young officer who had begun the day certain of victory was now discovering that war in the Yugoslav mountains was far different from the neat diagrams in his textbooks. Maria watched the young lieutenant through her scope, seeing how he struggled to maintain control of his disintegrating command. She could have killed him easily, but something about his youth and obvious inexperience made her hesitate for a moment. Then she remembered her brother Alexander, who had been even younger when the Germans shot him down in their village square, and her finger tightened on the trigger. War had no room for sentiment, especially when dealing with invaders who had shown no mercy to her people. Her bullet took Lieutenant Weber high in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed against the boulder that had been sheltering him. The last German officer capable of organizing resistance was now out of action, leaving the remaining soldiers to fight as individuals rather than as part of a coordinated military unit. The difference was immediately apparent as panic began to spread through their ranks like water through a cracked dam. Captain Petrovich recognized that the momentum of the battle had shifted decisively in their favor. He signaled to his fighters to press their attack, knowing that this might be their only opportunity to completely destroy the German force rather than simply escaping from it. The resistance rarely had the chance to inflict such decisive defeats on their enemies, and Petrovich was determined to make the most of this unexpected gift from the mysterious sniper above. Young Stefan had found his courage at last, moving from cover to cover with the fluid grace of a natural fighter. His rifle spoke with increasing confidence as he picked off German soldiers who were trying to regroup in the shelter of a fallen tree. The boy who had started the day with shaking hands was now displaying the kind of deadly competence that the mountains seemed to breed in their defenders. His father would have been proud to see how his son was avenging the family honor. Anna Davidovic continued to serve as the group's medic, but she was also proving to be a formidable fighter in her own right. When 3 German soldiers attempted to outflank the resistance position by moving through a stand of pine trees, Anna was waiting for them with her rifle ready. Her nursing training had taught her anatomy in precise detail, and she used that knowledge to place her shots with surgical accuracy. The soldiers fell quickly and quietly, never realizing that their deaths had been delivered by someone whose original calling was to preserve life rather than take it. Milos Stankovic was using his police experience to read the battlefield like a criminal investigation. He could see where the German soldiers were likely to move next, anticipate their reactions to the pressure being applied by his fellow fighters, and position himself to intercept their attempts to escape or regroup. His mustache was now completely gray with dust and gunpowder residue, but his eyes remained sharp and his hands steady as he worked his way methodically through the confused enemy ranks. Old Jovan Nikolek moved across the battlefield like a man half his age, his limp forgotten in the heat of combat. The veteran of the Great War had fought in these same mountains against Austrian forces more than 20 years earlier, and the familiar terrain seemed to give him strength and purpose. His aged rifle was an extension of his will, each shot placed with the kind of precision that only comes from decades of experience in mountain warfare. The German soldiers were beginning to break under the relentless pressure. Some tried to retreat up the valley, only to find their escape routes blocked by more resistance fighters who seemed to appear from nowhere. Others attempted to dig in and fight from defensive positions, but Maria's continuing fire from the ridge made it impossible for them to establish any kind of secure perimeter. Her shots came without warning, striking with lethal accuracy from an angle they could never predict or counter. Maria herself was now completely in her element, moving along the ridge like a deadly shadow while maintaining a rate of fire that seemed impossible for a single shooter. She had developed an almost supernatural sense of where the enemy would move next, anticipating their actions and positioning herself to take advantage of their mistakes. Each shot was calculated not just for its immediate effect, but for its impact on German morale and tactical cohesion. The ammunition situation was becoming critical for both sides. The resistance fighters had started the battle with limited supplies, and despite their successful transition from defense to offense, they were running low on cartridges. The German forces had begun the operation with plenty of ammunition, but much of it was now scattered across the battlefield with the dead and wounded, and their survivors were too disorganized to effectively redistribute their remaining supplies. Maria was down to her last 15 rounds, each one precious beyond measure. She had to make every shot count, focusing on targets that would have the maximum impact on the battle's outcome. A German soldier was setting up a light machine gun that could potentially turn the tide back in favor of the invaders. He became her next target. Another was trying to use a radio salvage from their destroyed communications equipment. He too fell to her rifle. The sound of gunfire was beginning to echo off the distant mountains, and both sides knew that other German units in the area would eventually investigate the disturbance. The battle needed to be concluded quickly before reinforcements could arrive and trap the resistance fighters in the same kind of overwhelming odds they had faced at the beginning of the day. Time was now as much an enemy as the German soldiers scattered throughout the valley. Captain Petrovich made a command decision that would define his legacy as a resistance leader. Rather than trying to withdraw while they held the advantage, he ordered his fighters to press forward with everything they had, attempting to completely annihilate the German force before it could regroup or receive reinforcements. It was a risky strategy that could backfire catastrophically, but it was also the only way to ensure that this day's work would truly matter in the larger context of the war. The resistance fighters responded to their captain's call with the kind of desperate courage that had made the Yugoslav partisans legendary throughout occupied Europe. They charged forward across the rocky ground, firing as they advanced, shouting the names of their dead villages and murdered families. It was not just a military assault. It was an expression of pure fury that had been building for 2 years of occupation and oppression. Maria watched the charge from her position on the ridge, continuing to provide covering fire while feeling a fierce pride in these brave fighters who refused to accept defeat. Her rifle thundered again and again, each shot clearing another obstacle from the path of the advancing partisans. The Forsaken Ridge had become a platform for vengeance, and her father's weapon was the instrument of justice for all those who had died at German hands. The final phase of the battle lasted only minutes, but those minutes would be remembered and retold in the villages of Yugoslavia for generations to come. The surviving German soldiers, leaderless and demoralized, found themselves caught between the advancing resistance fighters below and the deadly accurate fire from the mysterious sniper above. Their training and equipment meant nothing when faced with enemies who fought with the fury of people defending their homeland. Maria fired her last 3 rounds with the same methodical precision that had characterized her entire performance on the ridge. Each bullet found its mark, eliminating the final pockets of German resistance that might have prolonged the battle. When the bolt of her rifle clicked on an empty chamber, she knew with certainty that her father's weapon had spoken its final words in this particular conversation with death. Below in the valley, the resistance fighters were completing their victory with the kind of thoroughness that the brutal nature of the war demanded. There could be no prisoners taken. They lacked the resources to guard them, and the German treatment of captured partisans made mercy a luxury they could not afford. It was grim work, but necessary for their survival and the survival of the villages that depended on their protection. Captain Petrovich surveyed the battlefield with mixed emotions. The victory was complete. Not a single German soldier remained alive to report what had happened in this remote valley. The resistance cell that had been trapped and facing certain death was now intact and victorious, having eliminated an entire enemy company through a combination of desperate courage and miraculous intervention. But Petrovich was a thoughtful man who understood that such victories came with a price. Young Stefan Markovich sat among the rocks, his rifle across his knees, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The boy who had started the morning with nervous energy and shaking fingers was now a veteran of mountain warfare, baptized in blood and fire. He had proven himself worthy of his father's memory, but the cost of that proof was written in the stunned expression on his young face. War had a way of aging men in hours rather than years. Anna Davidovic moved among the aftermath of the battle, providing what medical care she could for the wounded resistance fighters while trying not to look too closely at the German dead scattered throughout the valley. Her nursing training had prepared her to deal with trauma and death, but the scale of the destruction was overwhelming even for someone with her experience. She worked with quiet efficiency, her hands steady despite the emotional turmoil that threatened to break through her professional composure. Milos Stankovic was already thinking ahead to their next moves, his police mind automatically analyzing the tactical and strategic implications of what had just occurred. The Germans would eventually investigate when this patrol failed to report in, and the resistance cell would need to be far away when that investigation began. He began planning escape routes and rally points, falling back on the methodical approach that had kept him alive through 2 years of irregular warfare. Old Jovan Nikolek cleaned his rifle with the same care he had shown when preparing his weapons during the Great War. The veteran understood better than anyone that battles were won not just through courage and luck, but through proper maintenance of equipment and attention to detail. His rifle had served him well this day, just as it had served him in the trenches of the Western Front, and he would ensure it was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Maria began her descent from the ridge, moving carefully through the steep terrain that had given her such a tactical advantage. The climb down was more dangerous than the ascent had been. Fatigue and the emotional aftermath of the battle made every handhold treacherous, every footstep uncertain. But she had navigated worse terrain under more difficult circumstances, and she reached the valley floor just as the resistance fighters were completing their grim cleanup of the battlefield. The meeting between Maria and Captain Petrovich was one of those moments that participants would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of their lives. The schoolteacher-turned-resistance leader found himself face to face with the legendary ghost of the mountains, the woman whose rifle had transformed certain defeat into impossible victory. For a moment, neither spoke, each recognizing in the other the kind of quiet strength that the war had forged in the best of their people. Maria was smaller than Petrovich had expected, her slight frame making it seem impossible that she could have wielded the heavy rifle with such deadly effect. But her eyes told the real story. They held the kind of depth that comes only from great loss, and the determination to ensure that such loss was not meaningless. She moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked all truly dangerous people, every gesture purposeful and controlled. When they finally spoke, their conversation was brief and practical. There was no time for elaborate thanks or detailed explanations. Both understood that their survival depended on leaving the area before German reinforcements could arrive. Maria shared what intelligence she had gathered about other German movements in the region, while Petrovich provided information about partisan activities and safe houses that might be useful to a fighter operating alone in the mountains. The resistance cell prepared to disperse, following the standard procedure of splitting into smaller groups that would travel by different routes to predetermined rally points. It was a painful necessity. The bonds forged in combat made separation difficult, but concentration of forces made them vulnerable to the kind of coordinated attack they had just survived. Each fighter would carry the memory of this day's victory, but they would carry it alone through the dangerous weeks ahead. Maria watched them go, these brave men and women who had refused to accept defeat even when surrounded and outnumbered. She thought of her father and brother, wondering if they would have been proud of what she had accomplished in their memory. The rifle that had spoken so eloquently from the ridge was slung across her shoulder once again, ready to continue the conversation with death that had been interrupted but not concluded. As the last of the resistance fighters disappeared into the mountain paths that would carry them to temporary safety, Maria began her own journey back to the high country where she felt most at home. The battle was over, but the war continued, and there would be other days when trapped fighters would need the intervention of the ghost of the mountains. The story of what happened in that remote valley would spread quickly through the resistance network, growing in the telling as all truly great stories do. Fighters in other regions would hear about the mysterious sniper who had appeared from nowhere to save Petrovich's cell, and they would take courage from the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggle against the occupation. German commanders would read the reports of the lost patrol with growing unease, recognizing the tactical implications of an enemy who could strike with such devastating effect from positions they considered secure. New procedures would be implemented, additional security measures put in place, but the damage to German confidence in the region would be lasting and significant. Years later, when the war was over and Yugoslavia was free once again, survivors of the battle would gather in village taverns to tell and retell the story of the day. They were surrounded with no hope of escape until a woman's shot thundered from the forsaken ridge. Each telling would add new details, enhance certain moments, and transform historical fact into the kind of legend that inspires future generations to believe in the possibility of miraculous deliverance. Maria herself would continue fighting until the very end of the war, her rifle speaking thunder from a dozen different ridges as the tide of battle slowly turned in favor of the resistance. She would become the most decorated female sniper in Yugoslav military history, credited with over 200 confirmed kills and countless acts of tactical intervention that saved the lives of fellow fighters. But of all her many accomplishments, none would be remembered with quite the same reverence as that morning when 17 resistance fighters found themselves trapped in a mountain valley, facing certain death, until a single shot from an impossible position announced that the mountains themselves had joined the fight for freedom. The thunder from the Forsaken Ridge would echo through history, a reminder that in the darkest moments of human conflict, courage and skill can still change the course of destiny with the squeeze of a trigger. The legend of Maria Kovac, the ghost of the mountains, was born in that valley on that day, when one woman's determination to honor her fallen family became the salvation of men she had never met but chose to save because they shared her love of freedom and hatred of oppression. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, where legends are carved from stone and written in blood, no story would be told with greater pride than the story of the woman who shot thunder from the Forsaken Ridge.